Hello and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving deep into the different ways people critique imperialism. When we talk about a critique, we mean how different social classes react to imperialist policies. Based on their own ideologies, imagine a world where finance capital is so massive and concentrated in just a few hands that it creates this incredibly dense web of connections. This web doesn't just entangle small and medium-sized capitalists. It pulls in even the smallest business owners. At the same time, you have these powerful national groups of financiers, locked in a fierce struggle against each other, all trying to carve up the world and dominate other countries. What's the result? The wealthy, propertied classes almost universally throw their support behind imperialism. It becomes the new normal, with everyone singing its praises and painting it as this grand, glorious enterprise. This imperialist way of thinking doesn't stop at the gates of the wealthy. It seeps into the working class as well. There's no magical wall separating them from the other classes. For instance, the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party at the time were often called social imperialists. That's a clever way of saying they were socialists in name, but imperialists in their actions. This wasn't a new phenomenon. As early as 1902, the writer Hobson pointed out the existence of Fabian imperialists in Britain, members of the opportunistic Fabian Society, who also embraced imperialism. Now, when bourgeois scholars and publicists defend imperialism, they usually do it in a subtle, veiled way. They try to obscure the reality of its total domination and its deep roots. They'll focus on minor, secondary details to distract you from the main issues. And they love proposing completely ridiculous reforms, like putting police supervision on trusts or banks, as if that would change anything fundamental. It's actually rare to find a cynical, frank imperialist who is bold enough to admit that trying to reform the core features of imperialism is absurd, but they exist. For example, German imperialists writing in a magazine called Archives of World Economy would track national liberation movements in the colonies, especially in colonies that were un-German, of course. They'd note the unrest in places like India, South Africa, and the Dutch East Indies. One writer, commenting on a 1910 Conference of Oppressed Nations, summarized their demands: fight imperialism, recognize the right of subject peoples to independence, and create an international tribunal to oversee treaties. Then, he delivered his cynical punchline. He said these people offer nothing more than pious wishes. He saw no understanding that imperialism is inseparable from modern capitalism. Therefore, he concluded, any open struggle against it is hopeless, unless you just stick to protesting its worst excesses. You see the logic here? Because reforming imperialism is a fantasy, and because the representatives of the oppressed nations don't go further than demanding basic rights, the representative of the oppressing nation goes backward. He cloaks his servility to imperialism in a pseudo-scientific argument. It's a twisted kind of logic. This brings us to the fundamental questions in any critique of imperialism. Is it possible to reform its foundation? Should we push forward and deepen the conflicts it creates? Or should we try to go backward to calm them down? Because imperialism's political trademarks are reaction and increased national oppression, driven by a financial oligarchy that crushes free competition. A kind of petty bourgeois democratic opposition arose in the early 20th century. One figure who got caught up in this was Karl Kautsky. He didn't just fail to oppose this reformist movement, he essentially merged with it. And this is where he and his followers abandoned Marxism. Let's look at the United States. The imperialist war against Spain in 1898 sparked opposition from the anti-imperialists. They were like the last Mohicans of bourgeois democracy. They called the war criminal and argued that annexing foreign territories violated the Constitution. They condemned the betrayal of the Filipino leader Aguinaldo, whom the Americans had promised independence before landing troops and annexing his country. They even quoted Abraham Lincoln, when the white man governs himself, that is, self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs others, it is no longer self-government, it is despotism. But here's the problem. As long as this criticism refused to acknowledge the unbreakable link between imperialism and the trusts, between imperialism and the very foundations of capitalism, it remained just a pious wish. It didn't dare to join forces with the movements created by large-scale capitalism itself. This was also the main stance of Hobson in his critique. He argued against the so-called inevitability of imperialism and pushed for increasing the people's ability to consume goods, even under capitalism. This petty bourgeois viewpoint, which focuses on the omnipotence of banks and the financial oligarchy, was common. Many authors contrasted imperialism with free competition and democracy. They condemned projects like the Baghdad Railway, which they saw as leading to conflict, and they made their own pious wishes for peace. Even statisticians like Neymark, after counting the billions tied up in international securities, would ask in disbelief how anyone could risk starting a war in the face of such enormous figures. This kind of simple-mindedness from bourgeois economists isn't surprising. It's in their interest to act naive and talk seriously about peace under imperialism. But what was left of Kautsky's Marxism when he adopted this same bourgeois reformist view? Instead of a sharp analysis of imperialism's deep contradictions, we get a reformist pious wish to just wave them away. Here's an example of Kautsky's economic critique. He took British trade statistics with Egypt from 1872 to 1912 and noted that this trade had grown more slowly than Britain's foreign trade overall. From this, he concluded that there was no reason to believe military occupation was necessary for trade growth. He argued that capital's drive to expand is best served not by the violent methods of imperialism, but by peaceful democracy. This argument forms the very basis of the Kautskyan critique, so let's break it down. Another theorist, Hilferding, whose conclusions Kautsky himself once endorsed put it clearly, Hilferding wrote that the proletariat's response to imperialism cannot be a return to free trade, because that's now a reactionary ideal. The goal isn't to restore competition. It's to eliminate it entirely by abolishing capitalism. Kautsky broke from this by promoting a reactionary ideal in the age of finance capital, peaceful democracy, and the mere operation of economic factors are ideals that objectively drag us back from monopoly capitalism to an earlier non-monopoly stage. It's a reformist swindle. His argument suggests that trade with a colony like Egypt would have grown more without military occupation, without imperialism, without finance capital. What does that even mean? That capitalism would develop faster if free competition wasn't restricted by monopolies. But monopolies arose from free competition. Even if monopolies now slowed down progress, that's not an argument for free competition, which is now impossible. No matter how you twist Kautsky's argument, it just leads back to reaction and bourgeois reformism. Even if we correct the argument and say, as some did, that the colonies' trade with Britain is growing slower than their trade with other countries, it still doesn't save Kautsky. Why? Because it's still monopoly and imperialism. That beating Britain is just the monopoly and imperialism of another country, like Germany or America. We know that cartels created their own kind of protective tariffs, and have a system of dumping, selling goods abroad at super low prices to undercut competitors, while keeping prices high at home. If Germany's trade with British colonies was growing faster than Britain's, it just proves that German imperialism was younger, stronger, and better organized. It doesn't prove the superiority of free trade. It's a fight between two rival imperialisms, two monopolies, two groups of finance capital. Using this to argue for peaceful democracy is just naive. It ignores the essential features of imperialism and replaces Marxism with petty bourgeois reformism. Interestingly, even a bourgeois economist like Landsberg, whose critique was as petty bourgeois as Kautsky's, got closer to a scientific study. He didn't just compare one country and one colony. He examined an imperialist country's exports to two groups, countries that were financially dependent on it, and countries that were financially independent. Here's what he found for Germany between 1889 and 1908. Exports to financially dependent countries like Romania, Portugal, and Argentina grew by 92%. Exports to financially independent countries like Great Britain, France, and Switzerland grew by 87%. Landsberg himself didn't draw any conclusions, and strangely, he failed to notice that his own figures, if they prove anything, prove him wrong. The exports to the financially dependent countries grew slightly faster. This data, while not complete, reveals that the core assumption of the reformist critique, that imperialism hinders economic growth compared to some imagined peaceful alternatives, simply doesn't hold up when you look closer at the numbers. The engine of imperialism, finance capital, creates its own logic of expansion, a logic that can't be wished away with reformist dreams. Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe for our next installment as we continue to unpack these complex ideas.